institutions, the rule of law and the federal judiciary, the life of the mind and the university, that should try to maintain their distance from politics, even when politics is pressing. Yet many higher education leaders gravitate toward Roth's position, whether out of conviction or self-interest. So, a politically lopsided university in which the far left has an outsized influence, particularly when that university scoffs at worries about politicization, deeming them objectively fascist, has been an object of conservative attention. Let me now say why, even if this lopsidedness has to do with what we call the pipeline, there just aren't as many conservatives who are interested in getting PhDs as there are liberals, it should be an object not just of conservative attention, but of nearly everyone's attention. First, partisan bias is really hard to overcome. In matters that touch on politics directly or indirectly, that partisanship might influence which subjects we think most urgent, which books we think it's good to read, which speakers we want to invite, which research conclusions we view skeptically, which students we view as pests to throw the conduct code at, and which we hail as heroes, and even what we're most inclined to challenge in the classroom as teachers. Over 80% of faculty surveyed by Harry agreed, at least somewhat, that it was their role to encourage students to become agents of social change. Well, what kind of social change? I'd add, next slide, please. Yeah, it's a little bit of a complicated one, but you want to pay attention maybe to the far right of this. That while direct evidence of discrimination against conservatives is lacking, there is some evidence concerning willingness to discriminate, especially in hiring, on the basis of ideology. Liberals and conservatives are about equally likely to say explicitly, yes, among equally qualified candidates, I'd pick the candidate who shares my political ideology. That's a measure of explicit, not implicit bias, which around a third, that's not a small number, admit to some degree. Liberals and conservatives are equally willing to discriminate, they suggest, but there are a lot more liberals than there are conservatives on our campuses. I don't want to make too much of this study, which though it replicates another is itself pretty small, but it's suggestive. If we think in other areas that even where explicit bias is mild, implicit bias might be playing a role in people's actions, why discount this evidence of non-trivial explicit bias? More broadly, shouldn't we expect, because we're only human, even professors who sit on hiring committees are only human, that even where we have pretty good professional safeguards, we're likely to be biased and to think that we're not. Likely to be biased and to think that we're not, especially when we're surrounded by people who share our ideological orientation, who on these matters think like us. Second reason to be concerned, the case for academic freedom has long rested on the idea that universities are nonpartisan institutions of learning. That's from the 1915 American Association of University Professors Declaration, which is sort of the founding document for American academic freedom. The more we decide that it's appropriate, even necessary, for universities to promote a particular vision of social justice, the more it makes perfect sense for legislators and trustees to say, well, you know, if there's a politics here, I'd rather it be mine than yours. If there's a politics here, I'd rather it be mine than yours. This is indeed what Republican state legislators are saying in bill after bill all over the country, some already passed, targeting education, including, in some cases, higher education. Will people who have been openly demanding to turn the university into a base for an assault on the loci of power, will they say in response to these legislators who are politicizing education? Well, it would be more honest to say, I reckon you've got us. Part two, why conservative worries are exaggerated. Whether because professional standards still matter at universities, or because much of university life is not politicized, or because conservatives still constitute about 12% of faculty, at least in 2016-17, I'll bet a little less now, it's not that bad on average for conservatives at universities. I'll look at two areas of concern. Concern one, conservatives are persecuted on our campuses. Indeed, as the conservative critic Heather McDonald puts it, we're in a free speech totalitarian crisis. Early this year, we heard from a Princeton student writing in the Conservative National Review that even mild-mannered, anti-Trump George Will was deemed too controversial to be invited to campus by a Princeton debating society. Stalin lives at Princeton, declared one conservative I've worked with. Conservatives have in effect been exorcised from academic settings, declared the student. Now, in fact, this debating society, the American Whig Clio Sophic Society, fancy university, fancy name, is organized to encourage debate between conservatives and liberals. Months before the Will incident, they had Ted Cruz to visit. Not long before that, they had Ken Buck of Colorado, who not long before his invitation made news for a video in which, brandishing his AR-15 semi-automatic, he dared Joe Biden and Better or Work to come take it from him. Setting aside Whig Clio, George Will himself was baccalaureate speaker at Princeton in 2019. A book on free speech by a conservative, Keith Whittington, was assigned to and made a focus of discussion for Princeton's class of 2022 and made available to every undergraduate, graduate student, and faculty member. And Princeton is home of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, which regularly brings in conservative speakers and visiting fellows. Robert George, who founded it, says that Princeton is a good place for conservative students. In short, yes, there are some things for conservatives to complain about at Princeton. There are. But if someone paid for an exorcism there, they should ask for their money back. Now, that's just one campus, but I think in some ways it's representative. Sam Abrams, who I mentioned before, at Sarah Lawrence University, faced calls to have his tenure revisited over his public criticism of Sarah Lawrence's diversity and inclusion programming. And although Sarah Lawrence is among the most liberal campuses in the country, Abrams's is not a unique case. Yet Abrams, without in any way denying trends that distress conservatives, also notes that conservative and liberal job satisfaction in academia are about the same. Right? I want you to listen to that. Conservative and liberal job satisfaction in academia are about the same, as far as we can tell. Even a bit higher for conservatives, the last they checked in 2016-17. Abrams's picture of universities is not as hostile to conservatives as one might imagine, is consistent with the findings of Joshua Dunn and John Shields, whose book Passing on the Right is based on interviews and a survey of conservative professors. Dunn and Shields affirm, as Abrams does, that conservatives can and do face significant problems, including discrimination in academia, but they also say that their respondents generally told us that the academy is far more tolerant than right-wing critics of the progressive university seem to imagine. Far more tolerant than right-wing critics of the progressive university seem to imagine. But Passing on the Right was written by conservative authors. Concern two, conservative students are compelled to self-censor on their left liberal campuses. There's something to that, right? I'll bet there's something to that here. There's certainly something to that on my campus. I've heard as much from conservative students, but liberal students agree that conservative students are compelled to censor, at least on my campus and in some surveys. This is a real thing. Multiple surveys have found that many students are reluctant to speak up about controversial matters, and that conservatives and Republicans are more reluctant than any other group to speak up about such matters, with one exception, religion, than their liberal and Democratic counterparts. On the other hand, consider the 2019 Heterodox Academy Free Expression Survey. This was just a couple of years ago, right? It wasn't exactly a quiet time in our politics. How many conservative students said they were very reluctant to speak up about race in class? How many said they were very reluctant to speak up about race in a classroom discussion? I want you to imagine a number. How many conservative students do you imagine would be reluctant to speak up in class when race is being discussed? The number on this survey was 7.7%. 7.7% very reluctant. If we're in the midst, as Heather McDonald says, of a totalitarian free speech crisis, then that figure would be closer to, I'm not a mathematician, but let's say a gazillion% than it is to 8%. But a few caveats. First, the same survey, somewhat altered, found more, about twice as much, self-censorship in 2020. Second, a 2021 survey conducted by the Foundation of Individual Rights in Education, they have a great acronym, FIRE. They surveyed 150 high-ranked schools, and they're about a third, now that's getting to be a big number, about a third of conservative students said that they were very reluctant to discuss controversial political topics, about a third compared to 10% of strong Democrats. So that's a considerable disparity. Third, self-censorship certainly varies from campus to campus. I worry about a place like Amherst College where fewer than 10% of students in the FIRE survey report feeling very comfortable discussing controversial political topics. I mean, that's a pretty small number. So I don't think that the data we've got scream crisis, and I think we should be careful about interpreting data about self-censorship when the extent to which colleges suppress speech is itself a partisan issue. Nonetheless, it seems to me that campuses, which for the most part show almost no inclination to engage with findings regarding self-censorship, ought to be conducting their own surveys and focus groups to try to understand what's going on, right? To what extent is there self-censorship? What are the reasons for it as well? All right, well, who cares whether the atmosphere at universities is kind of bad or very bad for conservatives on campus? I think it determines what one thinks can be done if you are a conservative. Increasingly, conservatives are following the lead of the classicist Victor Davis Hanson, who speaks of outlaw campuses and looks forward to a future in which universities will be vocational and students will get the humanities elsewhere. On DVDs, he says, right? That's conservative. Or of the conservative commentator Roger Kimball, who says that universities are dedicated to the destruction of truth and of the highest values of our civilization, and urges us to refuse to subsidize the perversion they're peddling. They follow that lead rather than the lead of Robert George, who I mentioned before, who says it takes maybe 5 people to make a big difference on campus. That is, the difference between sort of bad or very bad is the difference between treating the university as an enemy asset to be weakened or destroyed and treating it as an institution to which conservatives in which conservatives might do some good and in which they might have a stake. Okay, part 3. What might be a worthy conservative aim for universities? It depends on what kind of conservative one is talking about, but until roughly yesterday, many conservatives taking the American founding to be worth preserving and understanding it as distinguished for its openness to and dependence on reason might have said, with the political theorist Alan Bloom, who wrote the best-selling and influential work, The Closing of the American Mind, that colleges and universities are homes of reason. One advantage of that aim is universities say they embrace it already. Critical thinking, at least sometimes, makes it onto the very long lists of core values that colleges and universities, largely aping corporations, are cranking out with greater and greater frequency. So it's somewhere on that list usually. But reasonable people are not merely or even mainly possessors of a box of critical thinking tools, which shills, hyper-partisans, BS artists, your social media frenemy possess also. And they sometimes use those tools with frustrating skills. Reasonable people say to themselves with the 17th century political and educational theorist John Locke, can I get the next slide, please? There we go. It's right up there, but I'll read it anyway. There cannot be anything so misbecoming anyone who pretends to be a rational creature as not to yield to plain reason and the conviction of clear arguments. They consider reason an authority rather than as a tool with which to get the better of others. When we say with a hint of frustration, let's be reasonable, we don't mean let's review what we learned in Logic 101, but rather let's stop fooling around, let's stop puffing ourselves up, let's stop boosting our tribe, and let's try to see what valid conclusions we may be able to draw from what we think we know. And if we don't know enough, let's try to find out what it is we need to know in order to draw valid conclusions and how we can find those things out. This plea reflects our sense of the difference between the person Locke called a logical chicaner, a skilled debater, basically, and the person Locke calls the man of reason who seeks to improve his understanding. These are the two most different things in the world, Locke thinks. But the difference isn't notably on anybody's higher education agenda. To adopt the shaping of reasonable people in this sense as an aim for liberal education is to confront a problem as evident in Locke's 17th century as it is now. Even those whose intelligence and capacity to detect prejudice in others cannot be doubted have a very hard time picking at their own prejudices, right? They note the prejudices that mislead other men or parties as if they had none of their own. A person undisposed to question prejudices imbibed from education, party, reverence, fashion, interest, prejudices derived from miscellaneous sources neither chosen nor understood by him, isn't free and is protected only by good fortune, a happy fit between prejudice and circumstance for making dangerous mistakes. The learned are not immune, far from it, from failing to notice that the grounds on which they base their reasoning reflect their narrow experience. Liberal education seeks to correct this narrowness. We see but in part, that's the second quote there, we know but in part, and therefore it is no wonder we conclude not right from our partial views. The comprehensive enlargement of mind, that is another way of thinking of liberal education's aim, entails listening closely to what Locke calls the opposite arguings of talented people, showing the different sides of things, and listening closely to, even to those whom we think come short of us in capacity. Their experience may correct ours. It entails listening, recognizing the limits of the science that we study, the books that we read, the approaches and methods with which we're most comfortable, with which we're most at ease. It entails the study of old books as well as new ones, because part of our prejudice is the prejudice of time. If you can manage to travel, it entails travel, because part of our prejudice is the prejudice of place. Here are many of the elements of what we think of as a liberal arts education emerge from reflection on how one might overcome some of the many obstacles to becoming reasonable. I've already said that universities are in the critical thinking business. They're also in the reason business. There's still some dishonor attached there, for example, to clinging zealously to a dear argument in the face of overwhelming evidence against it, to being dogmatic, to propagandizing. All these are violations of what's called scientific conscience in the 1915 declaration I referred to before. The warning in that same document that the unparalleled freedom of scholars to set forth their conclusions rests on there being conclusions gained by a scholar's method and held in a scholar's spirit is a specialized version of the idea that the university is a community of people who are supposed to follow the evidence and arguments where they lead, and to share at least provisional standards for evaluating evidence and arguments, even in matters that can't be definitively settled. In appealing to that idea, the conservative is not appealing to something foreign to university people. For this reason, and despite the long pedigree of conservatism that appeals to Locke, one might doubt that I'm making out a conservative case for liberal education at all. The reasonable person seems suspicious of unchosen obligations and ties to one's ancestors, to one's children, to one's children's children, to all the elements called home, broadly conceived, that give most lives meaning. On this view, the Lockean reasonable person, listening to opposing arguments, attending to the experience of others, reading different books, looking at various approaches, leads a life that sounds good to fancy intellectuals, to put a populist spin on this argument, but bears no relation to the lives most people live or wish to live. There are conservatives for whom Locke is a villain. We can call them anti-liberal conservatives to distinguish them from conservatives. Let's call them classical liberals, for whom Locke is something of a hero. Anti-liberal conservatism is indeed not compatible in principle with liberal education, as I've been describing it here. Yet I think that even for the anti-liberal conservative, it's a mistake to pray for the demise of colleges and universities. After all, Patrick Deneen's, he's a well-known conservative intellectual, his book, Why Liberalism Failed, proposes that liberalism, while it may eventually sink under its own weight, is today entirely pervasive and triumphant, constituting a cave so dark and deep that alternatives to it cannot be imagined. He himself is compelled to turn to Locke and others to try to reconstruct a political philosophy that's too dominant otherwise to get one's head around, and to Greek and Roman authors to find some kind of alternative to it. That is, he turns to books that are mainly read still at our colleges and universities. Contrary to the reports of the demise of such books, they rank very high on the Open Syllabus's project's list of books that students get assigned. If colleges and universities were to practice liberal education as the shaping of reasonable people, it would be still more true that in an ocean of liberalism, of progressivism, as the illiberal conservative understands it, the university would be one of few islands in which one might reflect on alternatives. Even when liberal education is understood to be the shaping of reasonable people, it's not, as the illiberal conservative argument suggests, merely or primarily for the training up of intellectuals. For Locke, whose education is directed toward men of the world, one pursues enlargement of mind to whatever extent opportunity affords, because understanding is the last resort one has, whether a scholar, a laborer, or both, in the conduct of oneself in every important matter. This proposition is not straightforward or uncontroversial, but it suggests that liberal education serves a permanent need and not a party. So I just wanted to end a talk with the word party. Happy to take questions. You want to get us started?
Hello. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, would you agree with the idea that the Overton window in the United States, basically that the Democratic Party, which is the so-called left-leaning party, isn't so left-leaning and is actually quite conservative? Would you agree with that idea? And if so, how would that complicate the surveys and partisan nature of the idea that universities are left-leaning and far right, or far left?
Thanks. Yeah, what's your name? Tim. Thank you for the question. So the question to repeat is it the case that the people who are now called liberals, or the Democratic Party as it constituted presently, is more or less a conservative party? And if that's the case, how would that affect my argument? There's clearly a sense in which when conservatives say that the Democratic Party is hyper-liberal, there's a lot of counter-evidence, right? So one thing you hear conservatives say, for example, is that the Squad, Alexandria Cortez and so on, have an overwhelming influence on the party, and they certainly have some influence, but that's at least somewhat belied by the fact that we just had a vote in Congress, for example, on the withdrawal of aid to Israel, right, on the Iron Dome, which if the Democratic Party was sort of a far left party, you would have expected them to vote against that funding probably, based on where the far left sits right now, but approximately 4 representatives in the Democratic Party voted against that aid. So that tells you there's something to the notion that the Democratic Party isn't a far left party. I think that's right. I guess I don't think it's right, although obviously to some extent this depends on what perspective you're looking at. So if you look relative to where the middle of the country sits, I don't think that the Democratic Party looks particularly conservative, right? They're looking to pass a massive spending package, right at this very moment. Some of their appointees, for example, appointee who's now up in the Department of Education, right, has been blamed in the prior administration, the Obama administration, for actions on sexual harassment at colleges and universities that a lot of conservatives certainly don't think terribly well of, and I think also people in the middle sometimes find puzzling. So I think there's no question that, the Democratic Party elected Joe Biden. It didn't elect Bernie Sanders, and that means that's not a far-left party. But is it a conservative party? I think probably not by any standard in recent history that takes into account where the middle of the country sits right now. Thank you.
Hi. Ooh, are we on? Are we on? I don't think we're on. That can be loud. I could yell so loud. You know that, Raleigh. I'm a theater major. Is that better? Anyways, I'll be really loud. My name is Ket, and my question kind of falls in line with the idea. We spoke a little bit about conservative values, especially in higher education, and an opinion question to you. How much of those do you actually think are conservative values versus how much of it do you think is just pure bigotry?
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, you won't be surprised to learn that I don't think anything I've said on stage today is representative of bigotry. So in that sense, I think the values I'm defending in this particular talk don't fall under that heading. I do think that, I recently taught a class on American conservatism with a colleague of mine who's a democratic socialist. We team taught the course, and so we spent some time on the history of the conservative movement. We spent some time on its position with respect to the civil rights movement, which was, at least in my view, not the right position, and one that William Buckley later apologized for taking at the time. But if you're asking me, do people on the left have reason to trust conservatives on these matters? I think probably not, right? That is to say that conservatives do have a reckoning to do with the past of their movement, but also some present elements in the movement as well. I will say that before the election of 2016, there weren't a lot of movement conservatives, right? Very few, especially among conservative thinkers, who came out in favor of the Trump administration. So the National Review, which is sort of the historical conservative publication in the country, published an issue called Against Trump. Now, I don't mean to put together Trump and equate him with bigotry per se, but what I'm trying to suggest is that the conservative movement has a lot of pieces, right? It has components, right? There's the classical liberal element, which is above all concerned with individual freedom. There's the traditionalist element, which is concerned with the dissolution of attachments to local communities, which is concerned about national character and things like that. And some of those arguments do and have veered in the direction of bigotry. That's simply true. But I think that, in a way, That's true of all movements with PASS. They need to come to terms with their different elements. It's true if movements are made up of disparate elements, right? They have to come to terms with and try to try to deal with and push out, right? Elements that they think are poisoning the movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering, in one of your slides, you had stated, it had said that there are conservatives and liberals who go through the hiring process and that they explicitly discriminate so that they can have employees who share the same ideals as them. But personally, I just feel like that creates an echo chamber for people's worldviews and how that can just kind of close in a mindset, whether people agree with it or not. So I was wondering, how do we go about operating in a space where faculty, staff, or even students share different values and politics and making sure that they don't harm the success and safety of all students?
They don't harm what?
They don't harm the success and safety of all students.
Okay, I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, so can you give me the second piece of it again?
I was wondering, how do people in a space, faculty, staff, students, share different values and politics in which they don't agree, but making sure when we have those conversations that we don't harm each other, and harm as in like possibly offend or step on somebody's existence or well-being, you know?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate it. Thanks. So the first thing I want to say, just picking up on the first part of your question first, that the slide was actually about, yes, admitted explicit discrimination. That's right. Although it was about faculty members saying they would do that, right? That's to say we don't actually know what's going on, right, on search committees. So I think that's worth saying. When you're dealing with especially discussions that touch on politics, I mean, I tend to agree with Alexander Hamilton. I'll try not to break into song. But he says in the First Federalist Papers that in great national discussions, right, the Federalist Papers, he's talking about the discussion they're about to have over the 1787 Constitution. And he said that in this great national discussion, as in all national discussions where principles and interests are at stake, he says a torrent of angry and malignant passions will be let loose. Right? So I think to some extent it is the character of discussions that we have in politics that there is potential for real hurt. Right? I think that's true. On the other hand, right, I think it's a characteristic of political discussion, not just on college campuses, but off of college campuses too. You know, I argue that the university function, right, following a political philosopher by the name of John Dewey, is basically the truth-seeking function. So I think we have to understand all these things, right, in terms of that aim. What's best for the pursuit of the truth? And I'm certainly persuaded by the argument, for example, that if I'm sitting in my classroom and somebody hurls an insult at another student, right, a religious insult, a racial insult, an insult based on sexual orientation or what have you, that's not helping with respect to the truth-seeking function of universities. So I do think that we have to, at least when we're talking about what goes on in the classroom, uphold standards that are conducive to the pursuit of the truth, right? That standard can't be, though, right, that if I'm in a classroom, that I can't say, for example, that I think that Christianity is a false religion, or that I can't say, for example, that in my view, right, an atheist is going to be in big trouble, right, in the afterlife. Those things are hurtful. They are a direct attack, in a way, on the constituent elements of a person's identity. But those kinds of things can't be dispensed with, I think, in a discussion in which we're pursuing the truth together. So we have to find means whereby we can rid ourselves of modes of discussion, again, direct face-to-face insult, harassment, things that create a hostile environment in sort of the strong sense of that term. Those things we want to be rid of, and indeed on public campuses as well as private campuses, but on public campuses, the law says that some of those things you can't do, right? Not harassment, not create a hostile environment. So I think all those things are elements of helping us talk to each other better. But I'd say one more thing to this very good question, which is that that it does seem to me that we're not very good at talking to each other at all. And that explains, I think, at least part of our self-censorship problem, right? That is to say, self-censorship is sometimes because, we're in a position where we fear that if we state the thing we believe, right, somebody's going to jump down our throat and shut us down or talk behind our backs to other people and cause us to be ostracized and so on and so forth. And that's an element that you've got on college campuses, but it's also an element that you've got, at your Thanksgiving dinner sometimes, right, when you're talking to your relatives, right? Again, it's sort of the basic stuff of political discussion. I am interested in programs like Braver Angels is one that tries to get people together. Sometimes they're red and blue, conservative and liberal. Sometimes there are other kinds of groups that have a lot of trouble talking to each other and getting them involved in discussion, first moderated, sometimes informal, and trying to just get them in the habit of talking to each other and noticing that, well, that person does believe things which I consider heinous, which again is inevitable in politics, right? Take the identity elements out of it, right? Somebody who believes in a war that I don't believe in believes something heinous, right? So we've got people who we have to deal with who believe something heinous. How do we find our way to dealing with such people? Because they are our neighbors, right? They are our classmates, and they are people from whom we may consider some aspects of their understanding of things to be even disgusting, right? But there nonetheless might be something to learn from them. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming today. I really like your charts as a political science student. They're very good. But my question was, could you offer or give some insight into what the solutions are to this type of, I think about this problem because I think about political partisanship in general. In society, it's gotten worse. I think it's a big sword of people moving to different districts, different places, people grouping around each other. I don't really see how it can get better. The world that I envision is a world in the future is one where liberals go to Berea College and conservatives go to Liberty University. I don't see how that's not the end that happens. Because I don't see how it can get better in the current course of action.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm not going to speak to the broad national polarization problem, although I do think that's part of what we're seeing, right? That's not just an in-college or university problem, although I spoke primarily about the internals. What we're seeing is a national problem reflected to some extent in our colleges and universities too. And if I knew what to do about that, right, I wouldn't be here. I'd be counting my money someplace else. But I think colleges and universities can do a lot. They really are one of relatively few places, right? The workplace is another, but you don't really have to talk to other people at the workplace. Colleges and universities are one of relatively few places where you do have people who believe really quite different political things. right? I mean, again, conservatives are a non-trivial element of student population, right, across the country. So are moderates. There's not as much of a skew, right? And so here we are in classrooms together, in public spaces together, and we have an opportunity to talk to each other. And I think that universities can easily squander this. I do think that, it sort of starts to some extent from the top down sometimes. I think that university administrations could do a lot more to talk about the principles I've outlined as reasonability, or that I also call the truth-seeking function, not just in a sentence in their brochure, right, but also at orientation, right, and over again, just as with other elements that the college says it's valued, right, you hear about them quite often. You don't always hear about this other element. I do think that a lot of work has to be done in the area, in the classroom, right? Faculty members face polarized classrooms, and sure, some of our students are very reluctant to speak, but we're professional getting people to speak people, right? So we need to do a little bit more work on that. We shouldn't give up on it, I think. But so part of it is top-down, what administrations do. Part of it, I think, really is faculty members and students who feel cowed about speaking up, finding the courage to talk about things. But to find that courage, I think they have to see something in it for them, right? I think that's a big problem, right? Anytime that I decide whether I'm going to raise my hand or not, right, I'm doing a cost-benefit analysis, right? I'm not an economist, but I'm doing a bit of it, right? Is it worth it? Why should I do it? Maybe I'll sound stupid. Maybe somebody's going to get angry at me. Maybe I'm going to offend somebody who I don't want to offend just because I'm not sure, if what I'm saying might offend or not offend. So I think that students have to get, and faculty members have to remind themselves of the character of a kind of discussion in which we're not seeking to get the better of each other or win a political fight, but that we're actually engaged in seeking the truth together, right? They have to see that concretely in the classroom and other places. They have to see that it's important. In other words, this is a thing that if we don't do it, we're going to have a problem, even if we're strong political partisans. We're going to have a problem if we don't do it. You have to see that we can make progress in these matters, right? That's hard. We sort of understand how we make progress in mathematics. We have to be convinced that we can make progress when people have different opinions. So there has to be a lot of work on what are the standards and criteria that we use to distinguish between strong and weak arguments when there is no formula to tell us what the best argument is, where reasonable people are going to continue to disagree about things. And we have to show that there's pleasure in this, that it's joyful, right? And again, I think that faculty members need to remind themselves of this too, right? We often don't have time to engage in this kind of discussion, and we too are somewhat polarized sometimes along partisan lines. We shy away from that kind of thing. Why do we shy away from it? Well, it's not worth it, right? So we, colleges and universities, have to show that it's worth it, right? That's our job. Thank you. I think we have time for one more, right? Is that right? 4:15 is the? Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Given your expertise, how do you think students' political and religious affiliations affect their college applications and in turn the likelihood of their admission?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I don't have expertise in how admissions offices work, so I couldn't say for sure. I mean, I have, and I'd say two things, right? The first one is that I've already said that faculty members show some willingness to discriminate, right? In matters like, who am I going to hire? Am I going to approve this paper for getting to the next step? Am I going to write in support of this grant or what have you? So that seems to be at least potentially a real thing because people say explicitly, I do that. That's also what human beings do, right? It's not just college administrators. We tend to like to hire people who are sort of like us, right? And we'll tend to smile on people who share our views. And it's only sort of a powerful professional ethic that enables us to work against this kind of thing. I think most admissions officers are professionals, right? But at the same time, if somebody asked me, well, do you think that I should write an essay on how much I appreciate the work of Ayn Rand, right, a sort of well-known libertarian conservative theorist, I would advise that student, no, don't do that, right? Because it's hard to be sure. So I think that there is some reason to be concerned. I did read a book that was called Inside Graduate Admissions. This was about admission to graduate programs. And the author of it was basically interested in racial and religious bias in graduate admissions, which she did find evidence of. But she also, sort of almost by chance, found evidence of other varieties of discrimination. So she describes, and it's not clear how widespread it is because it wasn't a survey thing, she was just sitting around observing, right, admissions meeting, but she describes a scene in which a student coming from what looks like sort of a conservative religious college is up for consideration, right? And the faculty members quite openly discuss how they despise that orientation, how maybe they can knock it out of her somehow or another. So those prejudices do exist. I'm just not sure how much force they have in admissions, because I think admissions officers are also professionals, and they really try to bend over backwards to fight the biases that they have, at least if they've been well trained. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.